So I actually recorded this morning's shir in the Rabbiner seminar, but unfortunately there was a technical glitch and the sound didn't come out. So because I feel that anybody that is following this series, this is certainly a critical shir, I am going to record it again, although I'll go through it a little bit quicker than I do in the shir format. Also, just to note that I have updated the source sheet. So the shir of last week, I think it's Thursday, that contains the link to the source sheet, that will be constantly updated in Yetz Hashem to accommodate the extra sources. Okay, so there are 5 times that the Rambam, across his various works, mentions the idea that he will not rule on ideas that are purely matters of theology and ideology. Hashkafa, kafach in one place translates it as hashkafa, although as Rav Moshe Meiselman points out in the note in his book Torah, Chazal and Science, he feels it's not accurate. But that's probably a little bit too technical. But the basic idea, he definitely says 3 times in Pirush HaMishnayos, once in Sefer HaMitzvos, and one in Ma'amar Tchias HaMeisim, where he mentions the idea that matters which are purely theological, ideological, and have no practical relevance, at least it seems to be that's what he says, he will not rule on them. The first point that is worth noting is that it's, how shall I say this politely, it's not true, meaning that even on the very Mishnayos, where he says he's not going to issue a ruling, such as in Sota, he does. If you look in Yad, he does pasken them. And the same as in Shkogus, Hilchos Shkogus, where he talks about the issues of Korbanos, which in which he mentions in Pirush HaMishnayos in Shavuos that he's not going to pasken, he then does go ahead and pasken. And that's the first thing that needs mentioning. But let's see them in context, and we're going to take the 3 in Pirush HaMishnayos and run through them quickly and explain why they do not serve the purpose that some would have them serve. And I'm not going to mention names because it's not relevant. And the notion that there is no psak in Yonim of Hashkafa is simply, and utilizing the Rambam as the source of this is just erroneous. It is just false. It's not correct. But let's get an understanding of it. Let's see them in context. Admittedly, as you know, Pirush HaMishnayos was written in Arabic, and there's the translations, but it becomes clear what he means. So the first one is in Sanhedrin. On the Mishnah that says that the Doer HaMabul do not have a chelik in Olam Haba, writes the Rambam. Doer HaMabul, from the source sheet, it's source number 2 in the updated Makoros. Doer HaMabul ein lehem chelik Olam Haba. Aseres shvatim ein asidim lachzer. Kvar zocharti loch ba'omim rabbois, says the Rambam. I have already mentioned on numerous occasions shekol machlokas sheyiyeh bein hachachomim she'einoi ba lidei maisa. Any machlokas between the chachomim which is of no practical significance and relevance, elo shehu emunas dovo bilvad, it is merely a matter of dogma, theology, ideology, whatever word you want to use. Ein tzad lifsoik halacha ke'echad mehem. There is no side, there is no point, there is no relevance to paskening halacha. And then he goes on to something else, and he talks about why at this point in Masechah Sanhedrin is it relevant to mention whether the Doer HaMabul have a chelik in Olam Haba or not. So that would seem on its own possibly to suggest that indeed something that is of no practical significance, there's no point paskening. The second one is in the context of a Sota, and whether she has the zechus of Torah or not. He writes, and this is source number 3, Pirush HaMishnayos in Sota Peragimel Mishnah Gimel, Kvar amarti loch lo pa'am, I've told you, and not on one occasion, she'im nechliku chachamim be'eza hashkafa, and this word hashkafa Rav Meiselman takes issue with Rav Kafrich's translation of this particular word, and he points out that it's inconsistent with Kafrich's own translation in another place. But he says, it is inappropriate and irrelevant to say that we pasken like X and not Y, like this Amira, not that Amira. That's source number 2. And the third one, which is the one that's really most revealing to us, because here the Rambam reveals his hand and he gives us the context and the understanding of why it is that in these inyonim of Hashkofa, he is, so he says, he's not prepared to pasken. Again, like I said earlier, he actually does, but at least he says here he's not going to, and that is in the Mishnah in Shavuos. And for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go into the technical details. This is source number 4 on the sheet, Shavuos Perek Aleph Mishnah Daled. It's about exactly what the Seirei Rosh Chadoshim, the certain karbanos on Rosh Chodesh, what they are mechaper for. And he writes as follows: and here, these are the key words. This is the words to highlight. Because these are exclusively within the remit, the brief, the province of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, as they relate to him exclusively. I'll explain. V'omnam, he says, although it is true, verily it is true, him cholkim behekesh v'rayas me'apsukim, but ein zemokim lizko inyoni hahekesh hahem. Ukvar be'arnu, and I've already told you, and kol svara min ha-svaros she'ena boli de maisa min ha-masiyos, any svara, so it's not even logic, it's not even hashkofa, he says a svara, of piece of logic that does not manifest ultimately in the practical realm, but here he really reveals his hand, and he tells us by this additional clause, it puts it all into context. And he says, because it is something that is el Hashem Yisbarach. It is something that is entirely within the gift of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to decide. Let's go back and have a look at the context now, and now we'll understand. Whether the Doer HaMabul do or do not have a chelik in Olam Haba is relevant within a dimension which is exclusively the Rabbeinu Shalom's. It's his dominion. It's in Olam Haba. That's his world. It is true that the Chachomim, bit of hubris there, bit of arrogance. The Chachomim Chazal have a right, lokeil goymer alai, they can decide, and even, so to speak, compel HaKadosh Baruch Hu to follow them. The famous story in Bava Metzia Nun Tes, the Tanur Shalachnoi, where Rebbe Lezer gets up and says, Hashem, you already handed over to us. You yourself said, Loi bashamayim hi. But that is only vis-a-vis ideas and things which have practical relevance. Is this oven, the status of this oven, is it ritually pure or impure? Is it tamei or tahor? I need to know how to pass it. Whether the Doer HaMabul do or don't have a chelik in Olam Haba is Hashomayim Shomayim Hashem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides who gains entry into the kingdom of heaven, so to speak. Forgive the reference. But that is Hashem. It's Davar Chayzel Hashem Yisbarach. Whether the zechus of the Soito, Talmud Torah, will save her from blowing up, that's up to Hashem. And therefore it is not something that we are able to determine, because it's something that is exclusively the province of Hashem, and therefore it's irrelevant. But anything else, of course, is relevant. So that puts paid to that notion. Sort of in parentheses, over the page here on the source sheet, source 5, the Gemara in Sanhedrin. I'll just mention it sort of en passant very quickly. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Kuf Daled Amud Beis, brings an idea, a notion that possibly Chazal sought to exclude Shlomo HaMelech from Olam Haba. Now, I know that becomes problematic with what I said earlier, and I don't have the time now to explain how and why this works. But Bikshu Limnois, Omer Rabbi Yehuda Omer Rav, Bikshu Oid Limnois Echod. They wanted to include Shlomo HaMelech himself in the list of those that are denied entry into Olam Haba as a result of his chatoim, his sins. And the Gemara then brings a a litany or a list of supernatural phenomena that manifest to demonstrate that he is included. And finally, a baskoil. Interesting. And it's the very device which Rabbi Eliezer, in the famous Gemara Bava Metzira I mentioned earlier, trumps that. And he refuses to accept the ultimate authority of a baskoil, a heavenly voice. In this case, the heavenly voice absolutely is final. After various other supernatural phenomena, an Eish min hashamayim, there was a fire, a heavenly fire. Ultimately, a baskoil emanated and said, "This is my business." In fact, there were two baskoils. There was the first one which used logic, and the second one just quoted a pasuk in Eov. Says Rashi, what's going on? Says Rashi, and I quote, this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaking to the Chachamim who wish to exclude Shlomo HaMelech from Olam Haba. Is it within your gift? Do you have the authority, the power, the remit to choose who does and doesn't gain entry into Olam Haba? Says Hashem, and this is pshat in the pasuk in Eov, this is entirely within my gift. You have no competence, you have no authority to rule on these matters, because, back to the Rambam, these are dvarim hachozrim el Hashem yizbarach. These are matters that are exclusively relevant for his domain. So we've put paid to that. Let's move on to our second sort of mini topic for today, and that is the following. As we now begin to delve, the next two topics that we're going to face, the first one we're going to look at a little bit is the point in time at which certain ikrim become operative and become, therefore, the litmus test for whether a person is to be considered, to quote the Rambam, Michlal B'chlal Yisrael, whether you're included in Klal Yisrael. And again, we'll talk more about this in the future shiurim as to what that means at a hashkafic level as well as at a halachic level and the practical ramifications of this. But the Chasam Sofer has a tshuva as follows. Source 6. Chasam Sofer Chelik Beis Yeridei Siman Shin Nun Vov. He writes as follows. Somebody wrote to him a shaila and asked him about the vikuach, whether there are 13, these Yudgim, the 13 Ikrei Emunah, are there 13 or are there 3? The Ri'albo in Sefer Ikrim very famously counts 3, and the Rambam, as we know, has 13. Well, is it 13 or is it 3? Says the Chasam Sofer, Lo yodati shum nafkusa. I am unaware of any real relevance and ramification of whether it's 3, the number, whether it's 3 or 13. Ki im kriyas shem bilvad. It's just how you label it. Now, it is true, he says, Uladas hamakubalim. Now, sorry, let me just explain that. Meaning that you have to agree with all of them, and the only question is, are you going to call it 3, or are you going to call it 13? He calls it just kriyas shem bilvad. But there's no suggestion, and this is really a kind of another shia. You remember the Rabbar Benel wrote an entire sefer. It's not a very thick sefer, but he wrote a sefer, Rosh Hashanah, to partly argue with the Rambam, partly agree. And question is how you number it, but the notions and the concepts are all agreed upon. Is it 3? Is it 13? You can expand the 3 to become the 13. Chasam Sofer is very untroubled by that. It's just really your nomenclature, so to speak. Kriyas Shem Bilvat. Now, then he adds an interesting dimension. He says, Uladas HaMekubalim, according to the Mekubalim, Ein Kan Ikka. There is no such concept as an Ikka, because Torah is an infinite cosmic whole, and when one tiny piece is missing, if one Yud would be missing from a Sefer Torah, then the entire cosmic formula just doesn't work. The circuit isn't made. You do not have the kedusha of Sefer Torah if one letter is missing, and it makes no difference whether that is the Aleph of Anochi Hashem, of the Aseres HaDibros, or V'achois Lo Tantimna, or some minor biographical detail talking about somebody who is not even part of Klal Yisrael, Esav's wife, or that doesn't matter. Says the Mekubalim, there is no such concept as Ikka. Ki kol koitzim shel Torah, every crown on the top of a letter, Heim Ikorim, Ma Bein Zeh Lezeh, it is an organic, cosmic whole. And if you have the whole thing, or you have nothing. Fine. However, he says, Ach He'erani Talmidei Rav Agodol, Rav Meir, I've based in the Ungva. And here he invokes something which I'll just mention on passant because it's fascinating. There is a tefillah which is attributed by the Shloh HaKodesh to an Amoira Rav Tavyumi, and it speaks about the significance of the number 13. Now, the number 13 is a fascinating number. Gematria Echod, Gematria Ahava. In the Maral talks about every three-dimensional item has 12 lines. Yes, Yud Beis Kaveh Alachsoin. And then you have the 13th, which is the conceptual center, which holds all of those 12 lines of a three-dimensional object together, that they're not just disparate lines flying off into space. That makes it one. So again, the significance of 13. And the beautiful tefillah, some recite it at a bris, is mentions that we commit ourselves to Hashem using the number 13, both in head and heart. In head, it's the Yud Gimel Midos Shahatorah Nidreshes Ben, the 13 hermeneutic principles that we say every day in davening, just at the end of Korbanos. And the 13 Ikrei Emunah of the Rambam, that's head and heart. And in turn, Hashem reciprocates and commits himself to us, ultimately with the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, that whatever a Jew does, however far you stray, Afal Pi Shechata Yisrael, who the last one of which, of course, is V'nakeh Lo Yenakeh, which means that as long as a person does Teshuvah, Hashem will cleanse. And this is our arsenal. This is what we use on Yom Kippurim. And there's much more to say on that. There's a Bnei Yisachar, and I think I've got it here on the YouTube shir as well, on Chanukah, that Minoisa kan kanim, he says the kan is v'nakeh lo yenakeh. If you take out the kan of the v'nakeh lo yenakeh, you're left with Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is a multiple of 13, which is 26, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and it corresponds to the Shoshanim, 13 petal roses, and Shabbos, and Chodesh, and Milah, and there's a lot of Torah that can be said, 13 Chashmenoim, etc., etc. But the Chasam Sofer brings it here only in the context of referencing that actually the number 13 does have some innate significance, and he acknowledges that. But that's kind of en passant. I just wanted to mention that. Well, he brings it. Now, the bit, if you're following within the source sheet, it's the bit that's bold. And here he says, this is genius at a number of different levels, but it is fundamental and it's important. He's talking about he's talking about the Mashiach, essentially. That Hashem will come and redeem us. What would be, he says, you cannot say, it is unacceptable to say that this notion, this concept of a Redeemer coming at the end of time to redeem us, to say that if you don't subscribe to that, there is therefore no Torah, that it is, in other words, he understands that to say that something is a Yesoid or an Ikka, a foundation, what happens if you take away the foundations? The entire edifice crumbles and collapses. Says the Chasam Sofer, it is heretical, it is wrong to say that, let's say you were somehow to take away the concept of a Redeemer coming at the end of time. Would that therefore mean that the whole entire edifice of Torah and mitzvahs would collapse? Would I not then need to get up the next morning and put on tefillin? Would I not need to keep Shabbos? Would it be okay, therefore, he says, for example, he says, Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara in Sanhedrin says about the 10 lost tribes, he's of the opinion that they will never come back. What would be if we were to say that nobody will come back? There is no concept of redemption. That's how we would pasken. Would that therefore release us from the obligation to put on tefillin, to eat kosher, to keep Shabbos? Does that mean therefore that the entire edifice is gone? Chas v'sholom, he says. Very strong words. He says, even if we were to subscribe to that notion, we don't serve Hashem in order to eat the fruit of our actions, although he has promised us that. But let's say there was no afterlife. We would still have to do it. Ve'ein ze ikar v'lo yesod livnes alav shum binyan. Given she'ikar yesod hakoil. Now here, however, he flips it around and here it's genius. He says there is one thing and one thing only, and that is obviously belief in God, Hashem's existence, and that he communicates to us his Torah, and that the Torah that we have today is the Torah indeed that he gave, which we will talk about in the fullness of time. He said, but we come at this via a circuitous route. He says, the notion, the concept, conceptually, the concept of a redeemer, if that was somehow to disappear into the ether, that would not undermine the edifice of Torah. But it would. But not because of the concept, but because it is mentioned in the Torah. It is Torah. And if you take away the psukim in the Torah and in the Nevi'im that discuss Mashiach, then you have denied the eternity and the authenticity of Torah, and therefore you have a problem. But not because it's the notion of a redeemer per se. So elegant, so clear his thinking. The ikar and the yesod of everything is to believe in the Torah and the Nevi'im. And in the Torah, ad ki yavoi shilai, Mashiach is referred to, albeit alluded to, but this is the way we understand is what the Torah is referring to. And many, much more, less obliquely and very clearly in the Divrei Nevi'im. Imkain, misha mefakvik ala geula halos, anybody who denies or questions the ultimate coming of a redeemer, his problem is not that he's denied the concept of a redeemer per se, and thus all of Yiddishkeit crumbles. No, it's because you have denied the authenticity and the truth of something which is contained within the Torah, and thus you have denied the veracity of the Torah, and that's your problem. And with this he moves on, and this is really the key point in this Teshuvah. He says there is an Amoira in Sanhedrin, Rebbe Hillel, not to be confused with the Tana Hillel. Rebbe Hillel in the Gemara in Sanhedrin suggests, Ein Mashiach li Yisrael. There is no Mashiach, there is no human redeemer that will come to Klal Yisrael. Rashi explains, he wasn't denying the entire concept of the end of days. It wasn't about that there will be a redemption of some sort. The eschatology, that's the word I'm looking for. But, says Rashi, what it means is, Hashem himself will redeem us, without an agent. Now, Rabbi Hillel entertains this notion. For us, this is heresy. What happened? Was Rabbi Hillel chas v'sholem a heretic? Of course not. And he says as follows. He says, we don't pasken like Rabbi Hillel. If somebody were to say, I don't believe in Mashiach, the human Mashiach, the Kim Lake Rabbi Hillel, and I have a very good chaver, I have support from a very eminent rabbinic authority, Rabbi Hillel in the Gemara. If somebody was to say this now, such a person would be considered to be an absolute heretic, because you have denied the Torah and its system of deciding. Because the Torah says, we follow the majority opinion. That's how Torah is decided. That's how halacha is decided. And by saying I follow Hillel, it means you're saying you are denying the very system which is built into the Torah for deciding how things work, how halacha works. Because the Chachamim were the majority, and they paskened not like Rabbi Hillel. Shuv ein adam ru'ya limshach acharav. Now nobody can follow Rabbi Hillel, and if now somebody was to say there is no human agent as Mashiach, he would indeed be considered a kofer. But that is only once it had been decided and paskened. Now, when I gave shir this morning, one of the Talmidim, Gabi, asked me, well, how is that consistent with what we said, that this is something about only something to do with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the answer was, no, I answered him, this is absolutely something that's relevant for us. I need to know today what to believe, because this is something that is going to physically happen in this world. And in that, Chazal decide. Yes, we pasken, like, it's no different to the oven. We decide whether the oven is Tomei or Tahar. So Al Pi Rov, we could theoretically have decided like Rabbi Hillel, and then the Ikrim of Emunah would be different. I hope that's clear. Chasam Sofer brings also a proof from the famous opinion of Rabbi Eliezer in the beginning of Rabbi Eliezer the Milah in Shabbos Taf Kuf Lamed, he was of the opinion that not only could one perform the Milah itself on Shabbos when it is the 8th day, but also all the preparatory activities, including the forging, the creation of the knife itself. And indeed, in his locale, where he was Rav, where he was Morad Asra, that's what they did. But that is all before Chazal had paskened. However, he says, once Chazal had paskened, the halach is not like Rabbi Eliezer. It now becomes an Issa D'Oraisa to fashion the Milah knife, the Ismail, on Shabbos, and if somebody were to do so, and there were Eidim, he would be Chayav Misa, because it's Paskin. That is the very beautiful tshuva of the Chasam Sofer, very fundamental. And final point for today, I've hurried this along a little bit, is an idea which is brought variously in the name of Reb Chaim Brisker. Interestingly, it's Mipi Hashmua from Reb Chaim, but it's brought before us in Kovetz Ha'aras of Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, Hashem Yinkom Damai, in his Biurei Agodos, and he poses the following. He says, the Rambam writes in the end of Hilchas Tumas Tzoras that Miriam unwittingly spoke Lashon Hara about her brother. She loved him, she cared for him, and the Rambam is pointing out how terrible, how pernicious the sin of Avodah Zarah is, that despite the fact that Miriam loved him, she put herself on the line for him. She was Moshe Nefesh for him to stand by the Nile. She didn't give up on him. She loved him like a brother, and there was no question of her not liking him at all. And nevertheless, she misperceived the motivation for his action and his level of nevuah, and she got saras in such a public way. Can you imagine somebody who actually really goes out of their way, chas v'shalom, to defame and libel, even if it's true, somebody else? How terrible this is. Asks Rabbi Chanan, what's the proof? Maybe Lashon Hara is not so terrible, but the reason that she got punished was because chas v'shalom, she was a kaifa. What she said was heretical. We know that one of the 13 ikrim is that the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu is qualitatively different, and it has to be for many reasons. We will expand upon it. The Rambam writes there are 4 main differences based on the psukim, but in fact, it is so fundamental because we have to set apart the qualitative, the essential nature of Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah in order to authenticate the entire Torah. In fact, Hashem justifies, he says, the whole Matan Torah actually was, I am coming to speak to you in the thickness of the cloud, so that the people should personally authenticate your nevuah, as the Rambam writes in the 8th chapter of Yesodei HaTorah. That was the purpose of Matan Torah, and she got it wrong. Is she not a heretic? Says that, and therefore, if she's a heretic, maybe she got punished because of heresy. You have no proof, asks Rabbi Chanan, that the problem is Lashon Hara. Answers Rabbi Chanan via Shloimar. To source 7 here on the sheet. Miriam. This is the point in time at which the fullness of this principle, of the uniqueness, of the quality of Moshe Rabbeinu becomes revealed and apparent. When Hashem reveals and he says, I speak to Moshe Rabbeinu, ponim el ponim, and he points out the very unique characteristic of Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah. He says, but when she spoke, this had not yet been clarified, and thus it had not been revealed, and thus it was not, at that stage, an operative ikar in Emunah. And therefore, when she spoke about against him, whatever it was, it could not have been heresy, because it's only heresy once the dogma, once the idea has been revealed and established by Hashem. And until that point in time, it wasn't heresy, and therefore the only sin she could be possibly guilty of is Lashon Hara. That's the long and short of it, and to be continued in Yetz Hashem.